everyone, and welcome to the next episode of the CIH podcast. Today we've actually got a really special episode. It's a kind of crossover, a collaboration with Zero Ambitions podcast, and that falls on a kind of a joint podcast that we done earlier this year after the Scotland Housing Festival. So a couple of weeks ago, I joined Alex Blondin, Dan Hind, Duncan Smith and Jeff Colley alongside CIH Chief Executive Gavin Smart for a really kind of broad conversation. We talked about new build, we talked about retrofit, we talked about the PRS, we talked about the social sector as you expect, and actually we kept talking and talking and talking. So you have not one but two podcasts coming up. That'll be out in the next week or two, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.
All right, so we're here today with Gavin Smart, CEO of the Chartered Institute of Housing, Callum Chomczuk, former guest. Lovely to see you again. Duncan Smith, the redoubtable Jeff Colley, and Alex Blondin. Sarah couldn't join us today, she's stuck on a train. But yeah, we're here to talk about housing, and we've got two of the best placed people to talk about it from a UK perspective. Since you guys are figureheads of the largest UK professional body for the industry across private and social. That's right, isn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, for anyone who might not have heard of you, or both of you, I mean, what do you guys do?
I'll give you the elevator pitch explanation. So the elevator pitch explanation is that CIH is the Chartered Institute of Housing, which is the professional body for people who work across the whole of housing in the UK and beyond, because we've got an international membership as well. And in short, we exist to do three things. So we exist for our members to provide them with the help, support, advice, guidance, services they need to do their jobs really well. Second, like all professional bodies, we exist to train, educate and qualify the housing profession. And the third thing which we do, which is slightly unusual in the professional body sector, is that we say we have a role as the public voice of housing, and that refers to the fact that we do quite a lot of policy and influencing work with government. And an interesting wrinkle in that is that because we have a royal charter, we're actually required to act in the public interest. So we don't represent just the interests of our members. The key defining judgment for us is what's in the public interest. So we do those three things: members, training and education, policy and the public interest.
Oh, so given what we were just discussing about wealth accrual in housing, that puts you in a potentially challenging position.
It does.
Yeah.
Sometimes our job is helping government to do the things that they want to do, and sometimes our job is helping government to understand they might want to change their mind or to do things differently. I don't know if Callum wants to add to my description. What did I miss, Callum?
Nothing missed. Just to add, so Dan picked it up a little bit about that point that we represent the whole sector. So I think some other kind of representative bodies, trade bodies, focus on one part of the sector. That's a legitimate interest, where we try to consider the housing sector in its totality. And then that's the important bit about what the unintended consequences of changes to the PRS to the social sector, changes the social sector to owner occupation. And that is the challenge. But that's an important one, because actually we often talk about housing in silos and isolation, and unless you look at it as broadly as possible, we're going to miss actually the kind of the impact some decisions will have.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I wonder, just to pick up on the point that Dan was picking up on, if you've got a charter that requires you to have a public interest, which public or which part of the public? Because of course there's very different interests, and I think of in a country that I don't know what the percentages are for home ownership in the UK. It's high, right? But I'm minded of, the kind of hand-wringing that people who own homes do when they see the affordability problems that people have in terms of getting access to buy homes or even rent in some cases, and thinking, it's terrible, isn't it? And thinking that and saying that, but all the while watching the value of their asset increasing. Did you really think it?
It's a fair point. So we have a sort of slightly kind of folksy way of thinking about this, which I'll try to dress up in more kind of policy wonky clothes. So the sort of folksy way we have of thinking about it is that on balance, what we are trying to do in our policy work is help governments and the public in the country move from a situation where housing probably only works for some of the people some of the time, towards a situation where it works for more people more of the time, and ideally all of the people all of the time, although that last target is probably kind of illusory. Dressed up in more formal clothes, I guess you could describe that as kind of trying to get towards a more kind of Pareto efficient system, where we're doing the best we can with the resources and the policies available to create a system that works best for the country as a whole. And you're right, there are always trade-offs in those kind of policy decisions. And how we try to get to that judgment is to use the evidence. We say we try to be evidence-based. So we will look at policies or problems on their merits and say, on balance, is this more or less likely to take us towards that target of creating a housing system that works for everyone? Now, that's not an exact science. There's a bit of analysis in there. There's a bit of guesswork. There's a bit of instinct, a bit of gut. But on average, that's what we're trying to do. And it means that occasionally we will support some things that people might think are counterintuitive. On other occasions, we might find ourselves in a very painful conversation with politicians or governments, having to tell them that the thing that they like the most is precisely the thing they should not be doing. But our job is to speak truth to power and to the public.
No easy task.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, it's good to have you on as well, Callum, because you represent Scotland. So there's a dissonance built into it because of devolution has affected the housing market. So for our listeners who were paying attention, we released those bonus episodes that we recorded with you guys at the Festival of Housing back in May. And they're worth a listen. They're really interesting. We had Gavin guest in on the first one, which was about the right to a home, legal issues and social issues surrounding that. And then the second one was, it was a lot more interesting than I anticipated, because Gavin chose the subjects for us to attend, but it was the private rental sector. So you'd got representatives from all the 4 regions to describe their appreciation of the situation. And proper dumb, obviously, but I just hadn't thought about it in those terms, about how there are competing interests, there are different rules, regulations, policy drivers, policy decisions, demands out of the economies and out of the people, which must make your lives more difficult. At least more interesting.
Yeah, no, I think, before we started recording, we were talking there a little about the regard that housing has as a public policy issue. I think one of the things that we benefit from Scotland is, we don't have an international portfolio, we don't have a foreign secretary, we don't have a kind of chancellor portfolio. So actually, a lot of some of the big bread and butter things are NHS, their education, and their housing. And actually, I think that's why we've been quite fortunate in Scotland since the start of the evolution. You've had a lot of stability in housing, you've had a lot of stability in housing ministers, you've had a lot of stability in cross-party consensus on housing policy, and actually in how it's delivered. And I think that has probably led to, progressive change over that time. Now there's still a lot of controversy, so I think we're seeing this now in Scotland with a proposed changes to the rented sector, and you saw a pushback from private landlords around proposals for kind of rent controls being introduced in Scotland. There's a trailed news that this First Minister today, so this will be dated by the time this is out, but the First Minister today is looking at a freeze on rents. And I don't know if that's the private rented sector or the social rented sector. So there you can see the sector is getting more contentious, and Jeff's point earlier about the size of the kind of the owner occupation sector. We haven't really thought about that in any sense. We saw the PRS grow, we saw the social rent sector shrink. So we are potentially coming to an end of maybe that consensus era around housing in Scotland, where actually some more difficult decisions are going to be made. But that's the position that we all should be in. Politicians have got to make decisions for, as Gavin was talking about, the public good, and it's up to us as a professional body, as an interested organisation, to find the evidence to make that case. And I've said we represent the whole sector, but the heart doesn't matter what country you're in the UK. We're always going to say we need more affordable social housing.
Yeah. Do you get into co-housing? Sorry for cutting you off there. Do you get into co-housing and alternative models for housing delivery at all? Because it feels to me, and I look at I was really interested a few years ago. Alistair Parvin from the WikiHouse Foundation wrote a really interesting piece about the need to create an alternative housing market, a parallel housing market that's not viewed as a threat by the owner occupiers, for instance. Something that kind of Daily Mail reading, why are these people getting something for free kind of anger, where you find a way of providing quality housing for people whereby they can't, it can't be like Right to Buy where people get something very cheap and then a few years down the line they flip it and cream the profits for themselves, where you have quality housing but there's a kind of almost a permanent stock available for that,
I mean social housing. Social housing was originally intended.
Yes, absolutely. That's part of it too. But I'm talking about, Alistair Parvin's ideas. We should try and get him on actually at the stage. He talked about, identifying the elements that are causing the constituent parts for house prices, the developer's profit margin, the land costs, and so on. Strip the land costs out of it. Strip the developers. Go co-housing to get the developer out of it. Turn the building occupants effectively, or an organisation into the developer. Get the local authority to provide the land, and the land stays. Whether somebody sells the house, they don't sell the land effectively that it sits on. Stuff like that, which just looks very promising.
Yes, so the short answer is yes. Yes, we do. With a kind of more detailed answer, I guess kind of a couple of things to say. So first of all, just pick up on what Callum was saying. I think he's right. What's been interesting in certainly Scotland and Wales since almost the inception of devolution is there's been a consistency of agreement across the sector and government and political parties about the aims and ambitions that we're seeking to achieve. And I think that's led probably to great progress in Scotland and Wales than maybe in England, where it's a bit more contentious. Northern Ireland, as you'll know, Jeff, is always a kind of slight kind of a country apart because the situation there is more complex, although there has been some consistency. Certainly in terms of the social housing sector. In terms of kind of different delivery mechanisms, the answer is yes. So we've been involved, not centrally, but we've been supportive of and been involved around the margins of things like community land trusts, which operate pretty much exactly the way you describe, where they try to make sure that a proportion of the value is captured in perpetuity, usually the land part of the value, so that it can be recycled again and again. They're actually on a smaller scale, I think in England and possibly in Wales too. We've been quite supportive of and involved in promoting what are called rural exception sites. So this is a kind of planning designation which can be made available so that landowners who want to donate some land so that it can be used for kind of affordable housing or to help house the local community are enabled to put in place kind of long-term restricted covenants that mean that those homes built on the land can continue to be used for that purpose. But in a very sort of gentle middle class sort of policy professional body kind of a way, we're a bit sort of Malcolm X about it. It's kind of by any means necessary, right? So you need the big, large scale interventions. We know that a massive part of what happens in housing overall is driven by what happens in the housing association sector, the council sector, and with the private developers. You've got to play with the major players and you've got to try to make that work. But you need to be looking at all the options, and there are, we've been involved in work on a little bit of work with the co-housing association in Northern Ireland, community land trusts, cooperatives, tenant management organisations. It takes the whole thing and more to get to where we need to get to.
And you get your hands dirty with the house builders too.
You've got to work with the house builders, and part of working with the house builders actually is about. I had to challenge myself as kind of younger policy wonk. I used to get very cross about some things the house builders did until I sort of remembered, Aesop's fable about the fox and the chicken crossing the river and the boat, and halfway across the fox starts to eat the chicken and the chicken says, "What are you doing?" And the fox is like, "Can't help myself, it's in my nature." So quite a lot of what house builders do is not for badness necessarily. It reflects the model that they operate in, the expectations, and in fact the needs that they have in order to operate. So actually, to get to decent discussions and decent policy mechanisms, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to understand the incentives that people are operating with, and including the kind of the non-negotiable red line incentives that they might not want either, but which are a reality of the way in which their business model works. So a nice example of that, and things that we might say occasionally that make us a bit unpopular. Actually, it's quite hard to find a lot of evidence that private developers land bank, in the way that is reported in the media at large, because it's irrational. It's economically irrational, and they probably wouldn't do it. If they can sell a home, they will sell a home because they need the cash to pay down the development finance that they've been using to build out sites. So there isn't a lot of evidence of developers sitting on large numbers of unsold homes on purpose in order to inflate prices. That doesn't seem to happen. What does seem to happen is that they're pretty clued up about what they would call the absorption rate, the number of sales that you can get away any given geography at a particular time. And that's slower than we might all want it to be, but they go to that speed, not the other. And that's not irrational. That's just operating the model as they're given it.
And that's an issue to do with the nature of shareholder-driven businesses, because a business is
shareholder-driven businesses, but also the nature of selling into the market. So the nice thing you can do is kind of you can understand it by comparison. Social landlords don't have to worry about absorption rate with waiting lists at the scale they are. Basically, as fast as you can get the homes out, you can get people into them, you can get people housed, and you just don't have to worry. The only question is, how fast can we get this done? Yeah.
Well, it's more that the absorption rate is about ensuring an adequate return on investment for the shareholder. So it's servicing the shareholder need, and that is a legal requirement. Certainly in England, I don't know if there's.
Yes, I think that's partially right. It's also just about the number of buyers that chip up any working day to a site, with mortgages who are ready to go. And it's everyone. This is kind of like. It's a niche point at one level, but it's just interesting because the more you can understand the environment within which you're operating, the restrictions under which different actors operate, the better you can do.
But it's interesting how that has knock-on effect in terms of quality. So what can you get away with? Regulations being a floor, not a ceiling, but they're treated as a ceiling. Building regs across all the provinces, like it's the same the world over.
I think that's a fair comment. So again, that's about recognising incentive structures. So landlords, particularly social landlords, housing associations, local authorities, CLTs, and others, right? They got a long-term interest in the buildings, the homes, and the places they are creating. That gives them an immediate incentive to build and invest for the longer term. Now, the private development model does not necessarily do that. And policy wonks like me and Callum would say, well, there's a risk there of market failure, and that's where you need an intervention, and that intervention is called regulation. And you need to be pretty clear about making sure that those standards and that regulation is driving up the quality of homes, because there's a risk of a missing incentive in the market. And that's not to criticise, it's just to be realistic about what's going on. If by your very nature you're set up to sell homes and then move on to the next site, you've got a different set of incentives from a social landlord who's saying, I'm going to build these homes, we're going to be managing them in 50 years, 100 years. We need them to really last the course.
No, what's really bothering me at the moment, so to get on to our perennial obsession of demand reduction and retrofitting, is like the system feels wholly inadequate to address the crisis which is engulfing us. It's no longer an elephant in the room, it's an elephant you're saving to burn in the winter because you're not going to be able to afford your heating. Like it's a really parlous state, and
you're crawling into the carcass of the elephant for heat.
like Han Solo. Oh man, it's appalling. And it was really interesting, the PRS conversation that we had. We managed to get them onto the retrofit subject, and no one knows what to do. Everyone's looking elsewhere for direction and money to do it because it's not cheap. And I was talking with a lender the other week about managing the asset values, like long-term thinking about it, and how currently there are no drivers to make energy efficiency a factor in contemplating the long-term value of a property. Yeah, we know just from existing that is going to become a factor. Like if energy prices continue to rise, which they will until we decarbonize the grid and switch to renewables. I mean, even then, I mean, it's still going to be dear. Like, I mean, I've no answers here apart from more conversations. But I mean, I'm curious as to. Oh, Duncan, you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Well, yeah, I think I mean, it's really interesting, Gavin. I hadn't thought of the way you framed, how we buy or how consumers buy homes and how the difference between the social landlord and private developers. And I've worked in both. I've worked in private development for a number of big companies, and I've worked in social landlords. But there is a kind of connection, because going back to the point that we like to talk about the most, of which is retrofit, of course, one of the things that we are concerned about is the market approach for the delivery of energy efficiency services, and how, rather than how I to try and maybe articulate where I think we all feel here, and people listening to this on audio can't hear everyone's head, can't see everyone's heads nodding, but how do you engage the market so the market stays connected and stays involved in the decisions that you make? Because that's when you get efficiencies, and I guess that's what you're saying the market can't do from a new build perspective, because that's essentially what social landlords do. But if we're buying, consuming retrofit products, the onus can't all be on the consumer to buy those and hope they all work. How do you actually engage the market in a way where the market's responsible for the efficiencies of that service long term? That's a question, because I think if we don't answer that, or if we don't start to talk about how energy efficiency is delivered and maintained, we'll be back here in 3, 4, 5 years' time talking about the same thing. Lots of failures, lots of stuff that kind of didn't work.
That's a really good question. You're right. I mean, so the slightly sort of academic answer to that question is that government's got a range of policy levers available to it, and you're probably going to need to use the full range of policy levers, because at times what government does with those policy levers is it tries to send a different set of signals to the market than would be there otherwise, or in kind of posh, slightly kind of economist type terms. So what government is trying to do sometimes with these kind of interventions is deal with externalities, which are things that are not properly kind of costed into the price. So we know that we need to see reductions in carbon emissions, but the price of homes currently doesn't actually, it's not adequately pricing that in. We basically new kitchens, new bathrooms, double glazing, and they're the only things and conservatories that you can pretty much demonstrate have an effect on house prices. Most of the other quite complicated and very expensive stuff that we know we need to do for another reason, currently not adequately captured in house prices. One of the very few things to come out of the energy crisis, cost of living crisis, might be that starts to change, but markets are slow to turn. So then you need to think about, so what tools have we got at our disposal? And government has incentives in terms of grants, in terms of more favourable tax treatments. It has a kind of legal compulsion. It has regulation, and effectively it's also got sanctions, because you can see from time to time government uses, for instance, the use of tax allowances or treatment in a tax regime to deliver or to try to nudge or push towards certain kinds of outcomes. And I think in terms of retrofit, we're going to need all of those. So we need to kind of surf the waves as they arrive, and without a doubt, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis has sparked an interest in, oh dear, my home is very inefficient. How on earth am I going to heat it? What can I do? Is it now worth me looking again? So we need to pay attention to that. But government is going to have to support households for whom that's just a bridge too far. It's going to have to work with industry to think about innovative mechanisms to deliver that and finance that. It's going to have to use regulation. It's going to have to use I need to be very careful with my language, carefully selected kind of negative incentives. I think all of those things to gradually shift. The other thing to say is it's not entirely fair, but I think it's a role that the sector accepts. The social housing sector knows and understands that housing associations and local authorities are the biggest bulk landlords in the country. And because they clearly have social purpose as well, they accept that they will need to play a kind of a leading role, a kind of a learning role in being amongst the first to gear up and to understand what retrofit needs to look like. And I think they're up for that. They're up for that challenge. The kind of wrinkle in that challenge is, of course, what we have to avoid doing at all costs is looking as if we're experimenting on tenants and residents who are on the lowest incomes. Now, getting that balance right is incredibly difficult, but there is, I think the sector understands and accepts that there's a kind of leadership role here, and there's a developmental role that landlords at home own homes at that scale can play. So that's a very long, rambling answer, but yeah, it's going to need all of those things and more.
Well, it's a big,
And I
long,
think as well,
rambling. Sorry, Jeff,
just
go ahead.
before you did think Callum and Alex were looking to come in.
All right, sorry, love.
Callum, you go.
So I think I don't disagree with anything you're saying there at all, Guy. But I think part of, Duncan, the premise of your question is that we are at such a uncertain bit of kind of the market when it comes to retrofit, aren't we? So Gavin's right. We've got confidence in things like boilers or conservatories that we're glazing because they're known to us all. We know what we're asking for when we get them, so we can sort of work out what the cost is. We know how effective they'll be. We have no idea the heating systems that each home that we're all in currently right now. Actually, we don't know what the heating system will be in 5 years or what it would be in 10 years. And I think there's that. We're at a pretty exciting time, but a pretty uncertain time. And I think until we have that market confidence and we're more clear about the reliability and the cost of these solutions, I don't think we're going to have. We won't get there, Duncan. But I do think. But I think Gavin's other point that he touched on about kind of negative incentive requirements. I think that's we're already
carefully selected.
It's carefully selected. Thank you, Dan. We are going to move to. We're going to have energy requirements on homes in Scotland across different tenures, and the likelihood is you'll be probably unable to dispose of that property until it reaches its a requirement. We're going to have, and it's been a long time coming, we're still there, around kind of common tenements in Scotland about tenemental repairs, about people putting money in a shared fund around. Actually, there's certain responsibilities now, perhaps on owner occupiers in a way that we haven't had that culture of before. Since in the UK, and I think that's part of it. So suddenly people recognise that need to invest in a home, not just from an aesthetic or a kind of a comfort approach, but actually as a responsibility. Now that is difficult because that's expensive, and actually how we unpack the shared responsibility of meeting these costs, how people pay that over time is really thorny. But I think as we get that technological development, as we as a society, as a world, recognise our responsibilities towards that, I think you'll start to see the private sector, owner occupation, everybody maybe meet some of those concerns that the social sector are already delivering on that kind of placemaking and maintaining your property, and not waiting until it collapses until we actually try to fix it.
Yeah.
Just before Alex comes in, I think that's really interesting because one of the things I've noticed in the last 24 months is how the big ticket items in a house, whether it's for purchase or for rent, where kitchens and bathrooms and the aesthetics inside, people are much more tuned in now to the performance. The language that people are using, just in wider family circles, is much more informed about the performance. A good example, Dan, I'm not sure if I told you this, spoke to somebody last week. Their mortgage, which is a sort of low mortgage, 35,000 pound houses we're talking about here, their energy bills are actually now much more significant than actually what their mortgage payments are. I don't want to say common, but it's certainly becoming more common in certain areas of Glasgow.
Well, I was at a conference the other week. Sorry, Alex. What was interesting, I was talking to a surveyor, Daryl, if you're listening, Aya. What we were talking about with regard to how the energy crisis is affecting people, he was referring to conversations he was having with his mates, some of whom had come up and grown very wealthy. And they were all sitting around the same table, nursing pints in the pub with the same questions, like, how am I going to pay my energy bill this winter? How's it going to affect me? Albeit one of them might have been considerate in terms of his stables, I don't know. But everyone is still feeling the pinch in a similar manner. And this is a galvanizing shock doctrine style opportunity to accelerate change. Anyway, Alex, go ahead.
Well, yeah, for me, it was just more of an observation because we're talking about retrofits and we know there are a lot of issues because there are actually people living in them. And so there's a lot of impact, be it emotional or just even operational of managing around people living in there. So what I'm wondering is the new build sector surely should be also should have a responsibility in sort of leading the way as well, because a lot of the new builds, and I'm using an example of a friend of mine who's just literally moved into their new build home. 6 months ago, I gave her, thanks to obviously what we're doing on the podcast, I was able to give her lots of questions to ask the developer around the energy efficiency of her home. She got literally 0 responses. She was ignored, completely ignored. No one even bothered to say, oh, well, you might have this sort of insulation or you have an insulation, don't worry, nothing like that. And it seems to me, though, that a new build, you've got a blank canvas. So why is the new build sector not being more actively pushed to go, right, we are now building, maybe not passive homes, Jeff, but at least something much, much, much closer than that. Whereas I'm getting the impression, as sort of on behalf of my friend who just bought, that she is just getting the same basic stuff with, anything they can get away with, rather than having a house that is genuinely an energy efficient home. Yes, it has solar panels so PV on the roofs and everything like that. But I have absolutely no idea if it's actually energy efficient or not, because it's not because there's PV on the roof that it's actually energy efficient. And that's sort of nowadays we're like, oh yes, we put panels up there, so it must be energy efficient. But that's not true. So why isn't why isn't the new build sector, as it were, why is it not leading the way as well?
I mean, Alex, I can, from a Scottish perspective, and I can only speak from a Scottish perspective, so we are seeing new requirements come in place. So from 2024, new buildings that are consented are supposed to have zero carbon heating systems. So that's basically tomorrow. I mean, 2024 is basically tomorrow. I think we will ultimately see a little bit of first incentives. I think you may see in the kind of short term after that people perhaps pull back from new builds because there was an uncertainty around that. I think you may see an existing stock market, but ultimately we will be replenishing and having to refresh our stock, and that will be the norm. So I think we are seeing that. And I can't speak for the rest of the UK, and obviously I can't speak to how effective that will be. But there is that kind of natural leadership, and I think that's well communicated to the sector. Whether that's awareness exists amongst the public, I'm not certain. But I think that's exactly the type of approach that we should be taking. So the entire housing system is responding to the need.
Oh man, yeah.
I was just going to say, I've said this before, but with regard to new build, I wonder whether this is something, Gavin and Callum, that you've encountered. Our view when we were lobbying many years ago for energy performance levels to be higher, those planning conditions in certain parts of Ireland, and then for building regulations to be tightened, was that if you require it, if you make it a condition of either a planning condition or building regulations, ideally, then effectively it becomes a tax on land. It depends on how high land prices are to begin with, I suppose. But the point is that if it's a cost that, if the developer knows they're going to have to spend this extra on construction to meet the higher performance standards, then they have to bid less for the land. Unless they're convinced that people will pay a premium for the homes and will be able to pay a premium for the homes depending on the borrowing restrictions and so on, you'll end up. It was a property economist, Tom Dunn, Professor Tom Dunn, who put this argument forward for us, and it was very, very kind of important. And if you don't have that, the point is then that any developer who's trying to do better than the bare minimum with new build, for instance, they're just going to get outbid by somebody else who's willing to kind of pay more for the land, basically. Do you think there's something to that argument?
I think that's really interesting, Jeff. There's so much in this. So I suppose just 2 or 3 things to say. So first up, just coming back to the point that Alex made, this is something that CIH talks about quite a lot, and it's a source of enormous frustration to us that we are building homes now that we will need to retrofit, and that is bonkers. Exactly. And in a kind of UK to English context, the Cameron and Osborne government started out with a set of ambitions to get to co-sustainable homes, got kind of high performing zero carbon by I think 2016 originally, and then they canned it, and that was well, it didn't look like a good decision at the time to those that were involved. It looks like an increasingly bad decision now, because we've got probably getting on for 1 million homes that were built in that period. They're not. We're going to need to go back and retrofit them again. I suspect in kind of formal economic terms, that analysis, Jeff, is right. If you increase the costs of production, it reduces the ability of developers to pay more for a site. So actually, you see that played out in the social housing sector, where often social landlords will lose out bidding for a site to private developers, because private developers can go further. And actually, you also see it's one of the factors that has explained the growth of the private rental sector across the whole of the UK, but particularly in England, because private landlords continue to be able to access interest-only mortgages, and people purchasing for residential purposes don't. So that means that one party's mortgage costs are lower than the other, so one lot can bid higher. So you see the same kind of behaviour, and a lot of that in formal economic terms does get essentially any value over and above the intrinsic value of the property is regarded as land value. So I think formally you're probably right. It could be conceived as a tax on land value. If you don't have that kind of mechanism in place, I think you're also right that the only way for developers to build to a higher standard is to hope they can sell it as a kind of premium product, and that's probably a niche market. I think there are some people who are willing to pay more on extra and have got the means to do it, but in the mass market that doesn't work without creating a regulatory floor that says this is now the requirement. I guess there's kind of two further things to say, and they could both lead us down all sorts of avenues, so I'll try and keep it tight. So the first, which is one of my favourite quotes, is I think Wittgenstein went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Bertrand Russell when he became a lecturer in Cambridge, and Mrs. Russell asked him, "What would you like for dinner?" And he replied, "Anything as long as it's the same," because he didn't want to spend time thinking. Now, actually, developers say to planners and policymakers all the time, just tell us what the rules are, but don't keep changing them. So actually, I don't think the industry would necessarily argue against the kind of rules that you're suggesting, but what they would say is, please do them once. Please make sure you're happy with them, and then please don't keep changing them, because that creates a kind of hiatus in the market. The final point, and this is probably a whole other podcast, isn't it, in its own right, and I'm not the right person to talk about it, but actually that conception of land value, and also I think it's the 1974, is it? Or it might be even earlier, Land Value Compensation Act in the UK, which allows for kind of hope value. It allows for people who own agricultural land to retain the profit they can make in selling land to somebody who's going to build it for development, so they gain the value uplift, and none of that value uplift accrues to the state, which gave the permission that made that possible. There are quite a lot of people, probably me included, who might argue that that's a mechanism that has been tremendously unhelpful and needs to be undone, because actually, although the economists would say that was a tax on land value, people like me who are less charitable say, well, you're just about to cash in big time because you've turned this agricultural land into land for housing development. If the state takes a chunk of that away, I wouldn't cry in your beer too much, because the value uplift is still absolutely enormous, and it's one of the problems in our kind of housing economics. But like I said, that's probably a whole new podcast, and you want people far cleverer than me to talk about that part of it.
Well, I think it's an interesting expansion to the debate, because often we get stuck in the granular elements without. We touch on the sort of macro politics, but albeit in a almost facetious and scathing manner, rather than getting into the nuts and bolts of it, because we're absolutely not equipped to do so, and you two are.